when I was 11 and my brother 8. We lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and we came home from school on a Monday, February 11th, 1975, and my mom had gone.
Trauma is never the event. Trauma, and I get sometimes dinged for this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Trauma is not the fact that your mom left. It's the aftermath of that experience.
Yes.
What were the feelings that you had?
Being someone who's gone through big T and little t traumas, it's like an onion. We peel one layer away and we heal it. There's the next layer shown up and like, okay, here's this journey. I thought that was gone, but it's not.
The kryptonites to trauma is knowing I actually am worth something because I'm just able to show up as me. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Flip Your Mindset. I'm your host, Stacey Uhrig, and my guest today is Deborah Kevin. It's Kevin, right, Deb?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So Deborah Kevin is my guest today. I met Deborah through an organization I'm a part of called Virtual Networkers, which is a lovely virtual networking organization that we meet weekly and have the opportunity to connect with people that are like-minded. Many of our entrepreneurs, solopreneurs. And I met Deb because she actually owns something called Highlander Press, which is an independent publication firm, right? And there's a lot of authors in this group. And it's just been the most lovely group of empowering women. And Deborah has her own podcast, which I'm going to be on as a guest. And when we were talking about that, I mentioned my podcast and she shared with me a story that I just thought would be so great. If you know this podcast, you know that it's kind of twofold. There's a lot of storytelling and then there's a lot of psychoeducation. Today's episode is going to be a story. And I think she has a really important one to share. As everyone knows, my specialty is developmental trauma, childhood trauma, complex PTSD, and how that impacts us into adulthood. And I asked Deb what her story was. She shared it with me. And it is my hope that by listening to her story today, that at least one person can resonate. It's an intense story, and it's one that we might think is rare, but maybe not as rare as we think. And so if you're listening today and her story resonates with you, I highly recommend that you reach out to her. I think that she would be willing to hold some space or find one person that you feel like you can finally share your truth with, because that's the whole goal. It's security, safety, increasing connections, because that's what we need in the world. So welcome, Deb. How are you?
I'm doing really well, Stacey, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, as strange as that may sound.
Yeah, and I understand why you would say that. So why don't we just start right from there? What
Sure.
is it that you wanted to share? What is the story that's had the biggest impact on you in your life?
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting in reflection, like the story that I used to just say matter-of-factly or completely avoid altogether was the fact that when I was 11 and my brother 8, we lived in Jacksonville, Florida. My father was in Vietnam, and all of the rest of our family lived in Pennsylvania. And we came home from school on a Monday, February 11th, 1975, and my mom had gone. It was her day off from work, and I remember walking. We had gotten a car ride home from our private school with a person we carpooled with. And I walked into the bedroom to ask if we could have cookies after school, like an after-school snack. And I walked into the bedroom and I noticed this dust on her dresser. Her jewelry box was gone. And I started looking around the room and looking in the drawers, and the drawers were empty. And I opened up the closet and the hangers were empty. She was gone. And I wish I could tell you that I remember exactly what happened, but it's sort of surreal. I remember making dinner for my brother, sitting us both down to get our homework done, feeding our dogs. and making a telephone call to the base because there was I had no phone book, but there was on the refrigerator like emergency numbers. And interestingly, there was no emergency numbers for family members like our grandparents or anything. So I just called the Navy base, and I remember talking to a woman and telling her that we had a family emergency, that something had happened to my mom and my dad needed to come home. She didn't ask me any questions, but 3 days later, my dad arrived home.
Did you know he was going to be coming home?
I don't remember, Stacy. Honestly, I was so focused on making sure that we were going to be okay because my mom didn't leave groceries in the refrigerator. She didn't leave a note. She left no money. I remember calling the person who we had a carpool arrangement with. And usually my mom would drive us in the morning and this woman would bring us home. And I don't remember what I said to her, but I said, my mom can't drive. And of course, here I am, an 11-year-old kid making this request. Why wasn't my mom making this request? And for 3 days, she took us back and forth to school. Nobody at school knew that our mom was gone.
Or that you were living on your own.
We were living on our own. And we weren't.
How old was your brother?
My brother, who was 8, who, by the way, had a very serious medical condition. And it's like, I wish I could tell you what happened during those 3 days, but I don't remember. What I do remember is my dad, the day we were home from school. So this would have been a Thursday. We were already home from school when he walked in the door. And I hadn't talked to him. He had no idea what he was walking into. And he walked in and I just said, Mommy's gone. And I remember him walking into their bedroom and closing the door. And I was standing outside the door and I could hear him sobbing. Here's my dad. I never heard him cry. I never have heard him cry since. Just sobbing. And I just opened the door and I walked in and I put my arm around him. And, we were there. That was February. And in April, he moved us up to live with our grandparents in Pennsylvania. And the time between that moment and when we were leaving, my very last day of school at our school, I remember very vividly. I was just talking about this with my husband this morning, actually. We went to a Catholic school. And I still had no idea what had happened to my mother. I had no idea where she was. Or I knew she was gone. That's all I knew. Her motorcycle was gone. Her car was gone. All of her belongings were just gone. And the principal of the school was a nun. And she sat me down. She called me to the office and she sat me down and she had this box on her desk and she opened the box and she pulled out a set of rosary beads. And she handed them to me and she said, you have to pray for your mother's soul every day of your life. There was no comfort. There was no, are you okay? There was none of that. Even when we moved to Pennsylvania, it was like there was this unwritten rule. We never mentioned my mother. We never talked about it. There was none of that. My grandmother at one point, I was pretty surly actually when we went to live with my grandparents. And I was miserable. I wasn't getting any emotional support. And neither was my brother, honestly.
Yeah.
And my grandmother gave me this poem. And I wish I could remember the title of it, but it was an old poem because they were talking about a horse. So be grateful that you have two legs that you can walk on and don't worry that you don't have a horse and buggy. So more focus on what you do have rather than what you don't have. That was the emotional support at the time.
Well, first of all, everybody just needs to take a deep breath because anyone listening, including myself, knows this is very heavy.
Yeah.
And that the emotions in alignment with this experience are very complex.
Absolutely.
You're talking about sadness, worry, fear, confusion, powerlessness, helplessness, hopelessness, anger. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And again, when we're not able to process
Yeah.
Either A, we don't have that discrete language yet to be able to understand our emotions and our feelings, or we have it and we're being told, well, at least you should be grateful for what you do have. Let's not focus on what we don't have.
Right. Exactly.
Or, we share it and there's no response whatsoever. Right.
Yeah.
And
I
this
mean,
is
I
very
hid
common.
it. I never told anybody, like nobody ever came over to my house. I became an
So
extreme
you go to a
introvert.
new school and nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Yeah. I mean, this is like the massive elephant in the middle of the room.
Right. The shame. And the shame that I was so different. I was already different because I was the new kid, which I was used to because Stacey, I went to 13 schools in 12 years and 3 of them just in 10th grade. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, because I know how stressful that is. I see a lot of clients actually who went through a very similar experience, especially if it's usually because it was either the family was in the service, like you were describing with your dad, but I know that, or, just the dad was either constantly getting fired and moving around or moving up the ladder in a corporate job. Like the disruption to children when they have to start over and over and over again, and the burden on them, the responsibility put on them to do that. There's not a lot of language that kids have to be able to express that.
Right.
And even if they can, it's often met with suck it up. Life could be harder. There's a lot of denial of reality for the child. And so this is where we end up with extreme people pleasing, a lack of boundary setting, because there was no boundary allowed. You weren't allowed to express anything. You just had to.
Yeah. I was going to say, I once likened, so when you move in the military, the movers come and they put stickers, little red stickers with numbers so that they know that those are all your belongings that go together. And I said, I felt almost like I had a sticker stuck on me.
Oh, honey.
There was no like, you're moving, we're going here. So I think for me as a kid, like in reflection, you're completely right. Like I was a hustler for my worth. I hustled.
Oh, yeah.
And I hid myself very adeptly. And as well, I didn't even realize that I could create my own safety. And it wasn't even until, this is the sad truth, when I went through my own divorce and I had my children who were quite young, actually, I was like, wait a second, their dad just moved down the street. He didn't have to run to, we were in Jacksonville, which is like 8 hours from Miami, which is where my mom ended up living. It's like, that was an extreme reaction. And also, I'm very grateful that she didn't take us because the situation that she was in herself was not a good situation. And I'm so grateful. And my grandparents, for their lack of empathy or their inability to have the language for caring for kids that needed a little bit extra, they were loving and supportive, and they created a stable environment that I didn't have to be the parent.
That's a heavy burden. And it's known as parentification.
Yeah.
But and you did it even for the short period of time.
Oh, I did it long after that.
Yeah. I mean, especially were you on your own with your dad and your brother?
Yeah. And my dad was broken. He was just.
Yeah.
Can I tell a funny story? So my dad was in the military. And one of the things that I love to do is iron. And so my very first job as a little kid, I was probably 7 or 8. I desperately wanted to earn money. And one of our neighbors had been in the ice capade. She was a retired ice capade person. And I wanted to ice skate so badly. And so in exchange for her ice skates, which were gorgeous and leather and fabulous, I ironed for her. So I became an expert ironer at like 7 years old, something like that. And my dad's military uniform had to be starched. But part of his uniform were his boxer shorts. And let me just say, I was an expert starcher until he finally had to say, please don't starch my boxers.
You're going a little too far here with the starch.
They were so stiff they could stand up in the corner. But they were rather uncomfortable, I take that to mean.
Oh my God, that's great. I'm so grateful for you for sharing this experience. And one question that I have is, how did that experience? So you said something about adaptability, and I think what's lost on people is that we do adapt quickly, always.
Yeah.
And in the moment, the adaptability is perfection and brilliant, whatever it is that you come up with in the moment. But then after a period of time, that adaptability is maladaptive and or is just purely irrelevant and doesn't work anymore. And this is where the stuckness really comes in for people, because we're living through the adaptability of a 9-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 15-year-old, but we're 50. Right. And so it doesn't stick and it doesn't fit. And this is where I see a lot of disconnect. And this is where I see a lot of stuckness, specifically when I'm working with women and men. So how did this experience impact you 10, 20, 30 years later in life?
It really did. And I used to say in reflection, like I had a mom-shaped hole in my heart, and I was always trying to fill it. And there was a subconscious belief that I had that if my own mother would leave, what was I worth? And so I really ceded my worth to others. And I allowed, and it affected me in so many different ways. I was super productive in my career, hugely successful. Always, I wouldn't have necessarily termed it people pleasing, but I'm sure that it was at some level. If somebody had a project, every place I worked is like, give it to Debbie, she'll get it done. Like it's Debbie done. And it was like, at the risk of my health, I would have gotten everything done. So I think in retrospect, it is very much people pleasing and hustling for my worth. But in relationships, I didn't have a very high standard for myself. And so not healing that part of me, I didn't expect or feel like I deserved the best treatment. And it wasn't until I learned how to have the conversations about all of this and not hide this part of myself anymore, that even just speaking about it is like, shining the light into the darkness. And you can see that it's not so scary. Yeah, there are certainly impacts. Certainly there were impacts that were unhealed for many years. But also just being honest about how that felt, and then creating a safe place for myself, not looking externally for somebody to create safety for me or to value my worth. And so once I really, so I was married to my kid's father. That marriage ended when I had a newborn and a 2-year-old, thankfully. And then I remarried, but I married somebody who was abusive to me. And I so much didn't want to admit that I'd made another mistake that I stayed until it became so painful and I was at risk that I left. And then I took 8 years and I'm like, okay, there's a pattern to my life that I get to explore and figure out what I'm bringing to the party and what I need to heal within myself so that I can have a different experience. Around
what age were you when you decided to do that?
40. I was 50.
50.
So it was.
I ask that because I tend to find it's once the pattern has exceeded reasonability for the person, and it's usually 45, 50, 55, could even be 60. It could really be any age, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But 50 doesn't surprise me at all. And, to your point about the safety, I think those of us in the trauma recovery space know that safety and security is key. And, you said something, and it's not that I disagree with it because it worked for you, but I want to say this because it's important for the listeners to hear this. Is you were saying, I needed to find safety within myself. Some people have they have no understanding of how that can happen. And sometimes that's because the experiences that they had that were traumatic, maybe similar to yours or different, maybe happened well before 11. Could have happened at 2 or 4 or 8. And they don't have a recognition or a memory of really what safety is or have any understanding of how to create it. So a large part of what we do in trauma recovery is we try to create an opportunity where maybe we're the first place that safety's ever been had, and that it's safe to show up who you are, not what you do. Like you said, you were highly successful, but just show up with who you are. And I can't count how many times when I've tried to be that place for someone and I'll say, tell me something about yourself. And they'll say, I don't even know who I am.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of shame associated with that when they say that, because they think they should know who they are. And I always am quick to say, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to me.
I have a saying, we've got to stop shooting on ourselves.
Absolutely.
Right? And to your point, I think I had a maladaptive creative, like, safety experience. Like, I didn't know what safety, I suspect, because I don't have a lot of early childhood memories, that my mother was unsafe for a lot of reasons for many years. And that was her breaking point, right? But I did create the space because I did reconnect with her. There's a big span, but later in life, I reconnected with her. And I realized that because of what she had experienced at some point in her life and who she was and this journey that she was on, that she was actually very toxic for me. I healed and forgave her for her experience and how she treated me as a mom. And I knew that I deserved something different, but she did the best she could, which was a really hard nut to crack for me. Did she really do the best she could? And I do believe now that based upon whatever experiences she had, that she probably did. And I forgave her, but I also gave myself permission to not be in a direct relationship with her because it was not healthy. She was not a loving mother, but I did have lots of friends with lots of really great mom and safe examples. And I was really fortunate for that.
That is key. It is key. And it's interesting because I gave a talk last night on trauma. And one of the things that came up is, me explaining that when we have these experiences, now you were 11, but your brother was 8. When we have experiences from the ages of 0 to 9 that are adverse, however, it's a wide umbrella adversity.
Sure.
The only decision that a child can come up with between the ages of 0 and 9 is, it must have been because of me. It's the only thing that they can. And so, of course, a hand was raised. And I know the person, she has a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And she goes, so if your kid's under 9 and they're walking around with a lot of T trauma exposure, like a lot of little T, right? And maybe it's happening in the household, but maybe it's not happening in the household. Maybe it's happening at school or on the playground. Like, how do we prevent trauma? And what I said is safety and security. And I said they need one. They need one person that can be a good example, a solid, persistent, consistent example of safety and security, that the child can show up as they are and be loved for all of it.
Right.
100%.
And that's the breaking the trauma cycle so that we can show up that way for our own children.
And so you having a series of women over the course of a period of time that you're saying provided some level of safety and security that you could just be. is key. It's like the antithesis, right? It's one of the kryptonites to trauma is knowing I actually am worth something because I'm just able to show up as me and I'm cared for and I'm loved and I'm seen as a good light and I'm seen for who I am, which is good. Right. And I know because we're all born good, actually. Like we're all born okay.
Yeah.
We're all walking around with a lot of wounds. But what I find really interesting, what you're bringing into this conversation is something that's rarely not touched, right? Meaning it's a constancy in my sessions with my clients is the intergenerational trauma. And that often I'm praising my clients for finally finding a way to stop the cycle. And to your point, clearly your mother had her own invisible backpack with her own lived experiences, which did not start with your mother.
No.
Right? There's probably 6 or 7 generations of stuff in her invisible backpack from her parents and her grandparents and her great grandparents. And we're just not, at this day and age, we are not that far removed from some major global traumas.
Absolutely.
We've got holocausts and genocides and famine and Great Depressions. Like there's just so many major things that have happened within the last few hundred years that we're all still carrying on our backs, the coping strategies of all of our ancestors. This is intergenerational trauma. And so it's very, very rare that does not come up at some point when I'm working with a client. And to the point that you made is we can look at something and then garner and gain some compassion and understanding someone's inability or lacking of capability when it comes to nurturing and relationship or meeting just our most primal basic needs.
Yeah.
But we also get voice and choice and agency. If that person's not willing to do the work, we get to choose what's healthy for us. And we can say things like, I forgive you, and I even love you, but I actually will choose me because I can see that in this relationship, I'll lose a sense of myself again.
Yeah.
And so for my safety and for my health, physical and mental, I choose me. And that means there's going to be space and boundaries and protection that I have to create for myself. And I say that because I'm sure there are people listening. It doesn't have to be the same scenario, but they know that they have a parent that didn't really meet their needs the way that they needed their needs to be met. And there's often guilt and shame for not just sticking it out and just, but it's your mom, but it's your dad. And we hear that a lot.
Yes.
And it's not really fair to place judgment to someone and say, but it's your mom and, or it's your dad, or it's your sibling or whatever, or it's your child.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the reality is that we do have choice.
We do. And it's important because like I know that a lot of people didn't understand. And I felt my mother passed away in 2022. And my brother had a tangential relationship with her. I wouldn't call it a strong relationship, but they were in touch. And he really judged me. And I'm like, I feel really clean. I have no animosity. I really don't have any animosity towards her. I feel very clean in my decision. I was very clear with her directly why we weren't going to be in relationship with each other. I honestly wished her very well, but for my own mental health and I had an experience that came up during therapy, that I had blocked. And it happened when I was 10. And my therapist said, you should ask your mom about this if she knew about it. And it was pretty significant. And so I took that risk and I called her and I said, hey, Mom, this came up in therapy. I had completely forgotten about it, but it kind of came unearthed because of this situation. And I was having this very strong reaction to it, and it didn't make sense to me. And her response was, "Did you think I knew?" It wasn't, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you." It wasn't, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. How are you doing?" And it was like someone had taken ice cold water and just thrown it in my face. And all I could think to say was, "Well, I certainly it never crossed my mind that you knew." But in that moment, I knew that she could not be there for me, that everything was through the lens of her own trauma.
Amen. And that is when we can recognize that, to your point, you can have compassion and say, wow, this person's really walking around very hurt. And that's really unfortunate, because my ability to have a relationship with them is impacted on that and by that.
Right.
But it's also not my job or my responsibility to make sure that they're healed so I can have a relationship. You took on already a massive burden to heal yourself from a wound that you did not create.
Yeah.
And, we often are all doing that. And I do believe that that's part of the lessons of life. I don't think anyone's really spared that. And that's not to say, that's not coming from like this doom and gloom look on life. It's just life is a series of experiences that are very challenging.
Right.
There's a lot of gifts in that. And maybe for you, one of the gifts was knowing that you are enough to choose you.
It was a gift. And I think also to your point earlier about adaptability and maladaptability.
Yeah.
For being an extreme introvert, and I am probably one of the most extreme introverts you'll ever come across, I find it very easy to go into unknown situations and just meet people. But the people that I tend to be drawn toward are the people who are standing in the corner, who don't have anybody to talk to. That's who I'm drawn to, is to help other people be more comfortable in uncomfortable situations. And I have these antennae that just seem to always pick that up, because that was me growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a similar antenna. It's why I do the work that I do. I can see people's wounds very, very clearly, sometimes before they see it, or they have language to it. I already have language to it. It's like a sixth sense. And very often I'll sit and wait. I'll never share that I recognize it, and see if it ever comes to light. And if it does, I can hold space for it. And if it doesn't, that's part of their journey. Right. But that's one of my innate gifts. But it was also because I had so many of my own wounds.
Sure.
And I was able to identify when I see someone wounded in a similar way. It's like we have a radar. We're very attuned to it. And I'm sure other people are listening are like, wow, I can kind of do that too. Like, I get that.
I can read a room's energy like nobody's business.
Yeah, same.
And
but that's one of those adaptive coping strategies. You know, it's that hypervigilance of I'm looking out for the next shoe to drop. And can I predict it? Because I couldn't have predicted that.
Right.
You couldn't have predicted that.
No, and it's interesting too. The other, I used to always say when I was in my corporate career that I was like the stealth bomber, in that I did really powerful work, but I flew beneath the radar. Nobody ever knew. And like, I would give credit to my bosses for ideas. I mean, I had an idea that was taken to the Federal Regulatory Energy Commission and touted as like award-winning. My boss got the credit for that, but it was literally my work and my idea, and that I was okay with it. I'm not okay with it now, but I was okay with it at the time because I didn't want to be seen. It wasn't safe to be seen or to use my voice.
Well, and it's interesting because I consider myself somewhat clairaudient. So I'm constantly hearing things in my head when I hear people share things. And then I have like my own insight, let's just call it.
Sure.
And what I actually heard when you were saying that was, it's safer to be unseen, because if I'm unseen, I can't be left behind.
Yes.
If nobody knows that I don't exist, I prevent the abandonment.
Sure. Prevent it, and also the hyper independence. No one's going to, I'm never going to be independent. And I'm in a very healthy marriage now, with a wonderful man who has the most empathic heart I have ever come across. I mean, we met when we were 16, so I've known him a long time. His mom is one of those people who was, and both of his parents actually were like my loving parents for a long time. And still, his mom still is. There was a point to this that I lost the thread.
What was it? We were talking about being hyper independence. Hyper independence. Thank you.
So learning to lean in, because those skills have been, they have been honed, I wasn't going to be dependent on anybody for anything. And being able to rely on somebody who does what he says he's going to do and follows through. It's like slowly that last bit of, this next layer, let's be honest, this next layer of protective armor is falling away slowly and in pieces. But as you know, being someone who's gone through big T and little t traumas, it's like an onion. We peel one layer away and we heal it. There's the next layer shown up and here's this journey. I thought that was gone, but it's not.
But what I've learned, and I think, I know for me, it's pretty spot on, is the duration, the frequency, the intensity of each layer as we pull it off is less and less and less. And that's 100%. The beauty of the work. I always make sure that people understand when they're going to go on a healing journey. I ask them what their expectations are at the end. And it's a poignant question. And then they give it to me. And then I go, well, here's the thing. There's never an end.
Yes.
There's no end result here. This is about the journey and the process. There will be an end result, and at that point, you're done.
Yeah.
So, instead of getting so end result focused and thinking, well, if I do this work, then I'll never have pain again, and I'll never feel stress again, and I'll never have anxiety again. That's not, you're going to be just disappointed. So I want to set the expectations up front.
Right.
What we're looking to do is find a way to actually not navigate life more smoothly, but to actually be able to navigate joy more easily.
Yes. I love that. And you're building a toolbox so that you're building resilience as well. That's right. So that when something happens, because it will. How do you approach it? And how I approach things now is so different than I did even 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that I'm hoping that I'll keep growing through these experiences. So 10 or 15 years, I'll look back and say, I was a neophyte, right?
Yeah. But the reality is that, that is the goal, right? And again, diminished, intensity, frequency, duration. So you're not in that space as long. So you can access joy and gratitude more easily and more effortlessly and more quickly. I'm not a fan of toxic positivity by any means. No. So that's not what I'm talking about, but it's just more of, this is a painful layer to unearth, and I'm going to allow myself to feel all of the feelings experienced with that. But I also have the tools, to your point, to pull myself towards what it is that I do want quicker and feel the pain in a less intense way. Yes. We're human beings. We're not going to turn off the pain mode, though we can. Disassociation is a real thing, and some people are masterful at it, but It's not going to give you access to joy.
Exactly.
You can't dim the dark without dimming the light.
Yeah.
So
I think where we we have the opportunity is to not be afraid of what's in the dark and trust that we have the strength to get through what we can get through, especially with the help of someone like you who can leverage the tools and help build the resilience so that instead of having these big, long spikes with long tails, it's like, oh, I can recognize this is what's happening. I feel it in my body. This is what I'm doing. Okay, what do I want to feel? How long do I want to feel it? So I'm not shoving it down,
right?
Building the layers, but actually leaning into it so that it doesn't take as long.
What support have I created for myself? Connection's key to the healing.
Yes.
Healing in isolation is not really a very productive way of going. And so having some level of support and connection during our healing process is really, in my opinion, a key component, because it also allows you to feel safe and secure in your journey, because you're showing up in a messy time. And when you can be loved and supported, even in the mess, it really does shorten the period of healing, necessary. So this has been a very profound conversation, and I have really enjoyed it. And I've really enjoyed your ability to share such a big story with the audience, because I think it is very profound what you went through. And we really just kind of glossed over a lot of the ways that it impacted you in life.
Of course.
Right? Just for the essence of time, because I could dig into each one. I could dig into the burnout. I could dig into the marriages. I could dig into your health. We didn't even touch on that.
Right.
And the reality is that trauma is never the event. Trauma, and I get sometimes dinged for this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Trauma is not the fact that your mom left. It's the aftermath of that experience. What were the feelings that you had? What was the support that you had? How did you manage that experience? What kind of support did you get through that experience to feel safe and secure in your being of being enough? Because how that impacted you 10, 20, 30 years later, that's the trauma.
Yes.
That's the trauma.
It's like a scab that you keep picking off. Instead of, I always use it as that term, like instead of cleaning out the wound and really letting it get the air and the light and the love.
Well, I did a talk last night, which I mentioned to you off camera. And in the talk, one of the people said, does everybody have trauma? And I said, well, let's change the word. Let's call it wound. And actually, the word trauma comes from the root of the Greek word wound. And I said to the audience, I said, if you have a scrape on your arm, or your kid comes in with a scrape on their arm, how do you know that they have the scrape? We can see it.
Yes.
How else do you know that you have the scrape? I can feel it. Because sometimes you do. You're like, oh, what is that? Oh my God. Like, you feel it first sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
And then I say, what do? Oh, we put bacitracin on it, clean it out, cover it. So what I hear you saying is that you nurture it. You care for it.
Yeah.
And do you do it just once, or do you do it multiple times? Oh, you have to keep tending to it.
Yes.
Okay. And then what's the next phase? You get a scab. Yep. Okay. And what happens when that scab gets ripped off? Oh, it hurts.
And it bleeds again. It's like
it bleeds and
it's
great. And then how do you know it's been healed? And they're like, you've got new skin. Maybe there's a scar. And I'm like, good. Now let's talk about an internal wound.
Yeah.
Maybe it's pre-verbal. You've got no language for it.
Right.
Maybe it's not pre-verbal and you still don't have the language for it. The emotions are just too complex. You don't have the words.
Yeah.
Maybe you do have the language for it, but you share it and nobody wants to talk about it. And so you have no way to process it and you just shove it back down. And by the way, they say time heals old wounds, but these kind of wounds, they don't really scab. And so what ends up happening is 5, 10, 20 years later, you have and I'm putting in quotes, trigger.
Yeah.
And the wound is just oozing again. And at what point has anybody helped you care for and nurture this wound so it could heal? That's what I see trauma as, is just a handful of unhealed wounds inside everybody's system. And everybody has them. And it impacts them in different ways. And for some people, it impacts them really negatively. And for some people, it's a paper cut and it's not that big and it's not impacting their life in such a way that they need to make a shift. And when I'm able to share with that concept in that way, people are like, oh God, I have like 5. And that's why I see a lot of things that are offered as treatments initially. I always say it's a Band-Aid over a bullet wound.
Absolutely.
We're not really treating and healing the wound. We're just throwing a Band-Aid on it, and that is not going to work.
It's just temporary.
It's just temporary. And what we really want is sustainability. We want sustainable peace and sustainable access to joy.
100%. And the work is worth it.
The work is worth it, but it's hard.
It is hard work.
It doesn't feel good, guys.
No, and it is like you reopen the wound. It's like breaking your arm and having it reset.
It's like doing stitches without anesthesia. It's like you really have to do some of the hard work. And I think the right practitioner will create the safest space for it and the softest landing for it. But it does not mean it's going to be without pain. But what's on the other side is something, what I hear from a lot of people, it feels like freedom and liberation.
And peace and the access to joy for me. Yeah. I remember just standing in my kitchen one morning and like, oh, what am I feeling right now? This is joy.
They say joy. Studies show that joy is one of the most vulnerable emotions that we can feel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I could go on for another hour.
I know. I love this conversation. Thank you, Stacey.
Oh my gosh. So guys, I hope that you can walk away having learned something powerful, impactful, beneficial in today's episode. And if you have something that even feels somewhat similar, maybe you feel like you gained extra language today to an experience that you had that you couldn't really understand why it was still keeping you stuck years and years and years later, reach out to me. Reach out to Deborah. Her contact information, all of her information will be in the show notes. I think it's fair to say we're all here. It takes a village, right?
100%.
And just rounding it out, it's all about connection, safety, and security. So if you can find one person that you feel that you can safely show up in your truth and share, the truth will set you free. I mean, it's really the best statement, but it really does. Once you can start sharing your experience, it can no longer live in shame.
Absolutely. I second that emotion.
Guys, if you enjoyed the podcast, please do me a favor and like it, subscribe to it, because I drop a new cast every single Monday, and you'll want to be notified. If you're subscribed, you're notified, and then you don't have to be searching for it. And we offer conversations like this every week. So thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us today. Take care.